Hi, I'm Sam. This is week 4 of the 13-week course we're doing on labour history in Australia. This week we're dealing with the failure of the Shearers strike and the development of labourist, anarchist, reformist and socialist politics in Australia. So we're covering about 1880s to 1910. Look, firstly I'd like to thank everybody who's been here so far and who's here tonight, because you've been such lovely co-learners with me and it gives me strength to learn alongside you. We're using a historical method. History is about reading uncertain documents and making up stories about them. We try not to make up bad stories, but more than often than not, historians prove to be wrong, and being wrong is part of history. I've tried not to be wrong, but I've been reliant on other historians and my own weaknesses. Also, I'm not an expert historian in this period, so while I am a historian and can be wrong on that ground, I can also be doubly wrong because I'm not an expert in this area. We're also using the idea of putting the working class first and at the centre of our own history. And I'm using the ideas of composition, decomposition, recomposition. Composition is how we put ourselves together as a class. Decomposition is how the bosses react to that and try to weaken the things we've learned. And recomposition is when we react to it over again and produce new strengths, not necessarily like the old strengths. Last week we covered some major wins of a separate working class culture, such as the overturning of the master and servant laws in practice, which is basically the relationship more or less between a peasant and a master, or a whipped domestic servant and a master. We also looked at the idea of an 8-hour day becoming generalised in the working class as a win. We also dealt with, and this is rather nasty and not a great win, but it is a win when you consider what happened elsewhere, the general right of Aboriginal peoples outside of Tasmania to not nearly totally be physically exterminated. Given that the Australian boss class tried to nearly totally exterminate people in Tasmania, not having near total physical extermination of peoples is kind of a win, and it was a win won by Aboriginal resistance, not by the niceties of the colonial power. Unfortunately, however, this week the destruction of cultures, traditions of land use and a large number of people's lives and their very life continues this week, as does our interest in how race in Australia has worked within the working class itself and the tradition of partial wins. Starting with the genocide and invasion, we're looking at Carpentaria this week, which was enclosed, settled isn't the right word, by South Australian capital. The state government auctioned off pastoral leases on the condition that so many cattle would be run on land by a certain year. Otherwise the lease would lapse, which put a strong interest in running loads and loads of cattle on the land. This is where the Downer family, who were part of the elite of South Australia at the time, got a lot of their capital through blood. Alexander Downer's great-grandfather, I think, is one of the key genocides in this. Might be grandfather even, I'd need to look that up. The running of the numbers of cattle demanded by South Australian capital pretty much required genocide. This wasn't an accommodation between two people who agreed that they'd start moving cattle through the land. This was the amount of cattle who would both eat the low amount of crop on the ground and destroy the ground for further crop, which eliminated a large amount of the protein source available to peoples. Like last week, quiet private genocides outside of government control, supplemented with police actions, not genocidal police actions, but police actions where a whole number of people managed to end up dead at the end of them, even though they weren't meant to be a genocide, were the ways in which this went about. And like last week, physical and cultural resistance by Aboriginal peoples continued. Unlike last week, the absence of closer white settlement meant that instead of Aboriginal peoples, after the destruction of their land and the destruction of their land uses and what we'd call an economy, but isn't the right word exactly for people sustaining themselves, were destroyed, the people remained. Last week they ended up mostly in shanty towns, which were concentration camps immediately outside of white towns. However, in this area, the cattle runs are so bloody large, we're talking less than 1 cattle per acre. They're so large there is no white settlement to end up outside. And capitalism, being faced with the crisis of what do you do with these people who you can't kill off, sends in the missionaries. And this is where we get the remote community missionary structure happening. It isn't all one-sided, though. It isn't just a straight missionary dole being enforced on people. And these doles worked like a wage, much like work for the dole works now. On top of this, as argued in Henry Reynolds' North of Carpentaria, because white labour was so bloody drunk and incompetent this far north, which the British bosses viewed as white labour is unsuitable for work in the tropics, they had to come to rely on Aboriginal labourers, which is where we get the group of people who end up eventually fighting a union back pay campaign, who are cattle workers, and basically for white wages. The wages aren't great. They are definitely racialised. This is where this is the period when the idea of Britishness becomes really important for running Australia. So they've faced last week the exclusion of Chinese people, which came out of Chinese workers being undisciplinable. They had a language barrier they could use in their favour, and also being involved in Eureka-type actions. So the capitalist governments had already created Chinese exclusion and amplified this with an idea of Britishness. This is where Elders IXL, the massive agricultural capital conglomerate, comes from. The Chinese exclusion meant that they couldn't get workers from overseas, in part because the capitalists agreed that they wanted their children raised in a white British culture. They didn't want to be foreigners and outsiders in their own country. But also because of the discovery that labourers from other than British cultures could use language and culture against them. But in far north Queensland, which became decisive in this era, the economy wasn't like the settlement economy elsewhere. The capitalists on hand largely viewed themselves as plantation owners, like in the Caribbean. Free white labour was viewed as incompatible, and the idea of a brutal labour discipline based on non-British labour was present. Now, the only reason why they didn't get Chinese or Indian labourers in was because of their own incompetence and because of a fight with southern Queensland capitalism, which wanted a British colony. And so, as we also looked at last week, they turned to blackbirding. Blackbirding was a system of Australian slavery where British Australian capitalists went to Polynesia, bought the people who were at the arse end of the society there, or had already been stolen from another area of Polynesia. But unlike the African slave trade, it isn't from vastly distant. It's mostly from a local area. These people were shipped from a variety of Polynesian cultures which were viewed as incompatible to North Queensland to primarily work in sugarcane, which is backbreaking labour. Their death rates weren't as bad as African labour imported into the Caribbean, but they were pretty bad. This was not a working class which was meant to be settled and reproduce itself generation after generation. The slavery wasn't like the American system of slavery many people are familiar with, where the very body and offspring of the slave are owned forever and ever and ever. This was indentured slavery, so after a period of time the slave would become nominally free, which means they have to pay for themselves out of wages of the boss. And it's worth dealing with these people from Polynesia who developed their own ethnic identity, which is called Kanakas. It's also the white racist term used, but the term's used in both ways by the Kanaka people, to bridge the Polynesian island culture differences, to take on board Christianity for themselves, to bridge across cultural barriers, and to prevent them being treated as disposable labour. Like, I'm pretty sure the period of indenture with Kanakas was meant to be the period of total labour replacement, i.e. the work to death period. But some of them got free and they improved labour conditions through resistance, and they forged a multi-island culture which was very threatening to the white bosses on some levels, to the extent that they were becoming integrated in far north Queensland in general. The bosses also lost their free labour or not fight with the southern Queenslanders over federation. And the outcome of this is quite nasty. The White Australia policy around 1900 meant that the Kanakas were a problem for white British culture, and they were expatriated. They weren't expatriated to their homes were in far north Queensland. They were Australian workers living in far north Queensland as a new ethnicity they'd produced. They were exported willy-nilly back to Polynesian islands, largely to die. They had no social or cultural role in the islands they were moved to. Even when they were moved to a home island, intermarriage between island cultures meant that either the husband or the wife would be killed, even if one of them was moved to a home island, if not both of them for being unwanted in the culture they've returned to after 20 or 30 or 10 years. Great. And Australian seamen, of course, served on these extermination ships. Also in Queensland and far northern New South Wales, family-based migration from predominantly Italian, predominantly peasant families produced a new section of the Australian working class. These people moved over in groups, they saved within families, they tried to buy shares or stakes in sugarcane where they worked themselves far harder than white labour or even employed labour would work, but they were really integrated into the wage-labour relationship because they couldn't get ahead because they're Italians. They also worked in dairy, and unfortunately we're going to raise them below in terms of British racist mentality in Australia. We'll turn to Australian industrial capitalism for a bit because there is a split between rural and industrial capitalism in Australia. A lot of the profit is produced in mining or agriculture, but a lot of the capitalists work in urban areas in import substitution or in sending stuff overseas or in processing to send overseas. Industrial capitalism in Australia was import substitution, but primarily through small shops. We're talking about the small metal shop that sharpens scythes at the beginning of the period. But it was increasingly centralised and increasingly state-run. The state-run railways and the mining communities and the port structure centralised capital, particularly in long-distance transport, both the railways and sea transport. Sea transport was incredibly capitally integrated. British capital flooded into Australia in this period. Britain was going through a series of economic crises because Britain couldn't soak up the amount of production in Britain. So capital was exported to Australia, which matched the peak of capital export to the United States from Britain. This brought new technologies to Australia, the highest levels of capitalist productivity of the day, the best kind of machines, the best forms of labour discipline. There was a call for much, much more disciplined labour, not only go sharpen me some scythes, or go sharpen me some scythes to the rate of the machine, but sharpen me scythes to the rate of the machine in this precise way that I declare, and we'll watch you to sharpen them in that way. This is normally called Taylorism in the academic language because of this bastard called Frederick Taylor, who basically systematised it. We also kind of imported what academics call Fordism, which is workers should be able to buy their own products back, that there should be state-supplied services, mainly to increase the health and education of the workforce, because if you keep people in too much poverty, they can't run machines to time and motion under Taylorism. They're too sick to, they're on and off. And it suited Australian national capital. It wasn't conscious like it will be later or in other areas, but it was happening. The reorganisation to control labour in Australia's towns happened just as railways were unifying rural markets and destroying these rural metal shops, pulling all of the work back into city and railway organised spaces and centralising labour into a mass character. And the scale of industries in construction, like building construction, railways, roads and ports grew up on a new scale that had never been seen before in Australia. There was also a great dissatisfaction with the working class by the elite. The working class weren't disciplined to work to time and motion. They weren't healthy enough. They were sick all the time. They were living in slums. And new techniques such as parliamentary integration of the working class and schools were used. Schools were a new mass phenomena. Before this, women had educated children, both in the household and in factories. This was no longer viewed as acceptable. The kids were too much a bunch of larrikins that we'll deal with very shortly. And the state took over, or allowed the Catholic Church to take over, which was a very big fight in Australia, but not one between workers and bosses. So we'll put that aside for the moment. We can discuss it perhaps. Oh my God, 14 minutes. I'm going to have to skip a bit. The The creation of schools and of state plants also expanded the white-collar labour force under state control. We're talking primary school teachers because secondary school didn't exist for working-class kids. We're talking railway shift managers and engineers, professional degreed engineers. We're talking all of the white-collar bureaucracy that makes these complex labour systems function. So who were the working class in 1891, which is the best year I've got because of a census that was conducted nearly nationally? Per Ian Turner, workers were 92.1% of the population, or about 2.9 million workers. This is men, women and children. The total population was 30% in industry and 30% in agriculture. Workers were 133,000 in factories that would more than double by 1911. Of these, 30% of whom were in factories with more than 1,000 workers. The scale of industry in Australia begins as massive. 4% of breadwinners, i.e. adult males, because that's the way the bosses inflicted labour, discipline and wages on the working class, were unionised in 1891, and this grew to 18% in 1911. And remember, this is male unionists only, not all of the women and children working in Australia. About 30% of unionists were in big unions, which kind of matches big factories or big capital in general in a way. Real wages increased by 20% over the 20 years from 1891 to 1911, with between 5 and 10% unemployment rate amongst male unionists, and I expect this is higher among women, children and non-unionists in general. The largest body of workers who were organised in 1880 were organised in cooperative societies. Unions didn't matter. The Labor Party didn't exist. No other party organised workers. Cooperatives, the cooperative store that generally sold itself on offering better products at the same price. Flour you can actually eat, not with sawdust in, were the basis of ordinary working class organisation on the whole. This synchronised with labour-centred education talks and Sunday schools and newspapers. 30 Labor newspapers on average during the period Australia-wide, at least 10 of which were regional and increasing in regional percent. The Working Man's Club, the pub, provided centres of culture for men. Despite children being drawn away from the family by compulsory schooling, the workplace and community life in general, women's lives still involved loads of industrial labour and domestic labour for pay. So we're talking bring in laundry. We're talking probably to a lesser extent child minding or backyard production of food. Women were also central to the success of the cooperatives. Women have generally had a larger role in reproducing the family life by purchasing commodities in general, and the co-ops wouldn't have worked without women being involved and in favour. Amongst women, though, they were less central to the pushers. Now, the pushers were a series of violent urban street gangs of working-class youth, almost always predominantly male, who were viewed as dangerously larrikin and ungovernable by the boss class. Their aim was mainly street fighting in general, but they were also heavily involved in racist violence within the working class, the Catholic-Protestant divide of violence, but also against Italians. Anti-Italian rights were also organised by older, more responsible men in this time. So we can already see, even though Italians matched the idea of white Europeans, they weren't British enough to be fully integrated into the racial structure. Ungovernable women did exist and were to a small extent part of the pushers. I don't know young people who live out on the streets being gender segregated as such, but they weren't viewed as being part of the violent gang structure of the pushers. But they were also present in factories in large, large numbers. The ordinary working life for a woman would be work from 14 to marriage, and working class cultures in Australia would delay marriage when they couldn't afford it financially. So we're talking at least 10 or 15 years of labour in factories by women for rates very much below men. It was also part of the deal. You got your kids to work and then you lodged them and you nicked their wages. And they worked predominantly in light factories in the urban area, textiles, clothing, footwear, foodstuffs. These ungovernable women were not generally unionised at the start of the period, but their ungovernability was problematic. Kept them out of being British reproducers of family. If they were ungovernable at work, it meant that they were fighting back against the factory system in general. and they were viewed as difficult to unionise. They weren't self-unionising in the way in which other unions existed in the period. And we'll come back to that hopefully within 5 minutes so that I don't waste people's time with me talking too much. Capital did want British labour, even though there was still a labour shortage in Australia and massive levels of depression in terms of unemployment amongst men. Capital still wanted British migration, but they want to restrict non-British migration to make Australia a land fit for whites. What did they do? They got the government to pay to import British labour for them. Labor generally didn't want this. They didn't want any labour coming into Australia regardless of race, but they were quite happy to agree in general and on the whole with the racism presented outside of small sects of politically active workers who didn't have a mass basis to argue amongst the working class for something better. And of course, black British and Empire residents were excluded, even though they were British. And London, for example, has had a large black British population for a very long time as a major port city. Unions existed, but they were much smaller than the co-ops, and they were also much more fragile. Like, if you get a union to last 3 years, you're doing good. We dealt last week with some unions like stonemasons or construction, where there was a long tradition, or the mining chapels, where there was also a long tradition of unionism. But the unions in the new system, in the new areas of mass work, were much more fragile. Unions were reliant on what we'd call enterprise bargaining now, one-to-one deals between bodies of workers and a shop boss, or a body of bosses in mining and docks, and the workers involved. This meant that weak unions couldn't continue existing because they couldn't win a strike and they couldn't win a wage battle. And the generalisation of unions, up until what we're going to talk about shortly in the shearing industry, also was weak because of a lack of mass presence. The union movement did develop trades hall as meeting spaces and intercolonial union federations. The ideologies of these movements in general was democratic. This meant control over the policies of those enacting them. If we talk in 1850 about electing a man to Parliament, we talk about electing somebody who's a nice rich man and we think he's good and he goes to Parliament, he does nothing about what we elected him for. Whereas workers expected that democracy meant doing what you'd say and controlling this to a much greater extent. There were ideas reasonably widespread within the left of the working class for a cooperative commonwealth or for a socialism, and this socialism might have been through direct action or it might have been through state control, but it wasn't particularly precise in the way that, say, a Marxist or an anarchist today will talk about what do we really want out of socialism. There's an idea that wages suck, but also that shouldn't we have better wages, and this is confused in the idea of socialism. Whereas the idea of a cooperative commonwealth seems much more generalised, coming out of the cooperative movement and horizontal solidarity amongst workers. It's a living dream. There were tendencies who imported their ideas from Europe. From England they imported labourism and new unionism, which labourism was the idea that there should be a Labour Party in Parliament and that workers should be paid their fair due. New unionism was the idea that back when the Chartists tried to take over the system and wreck it and build a new system of cooperative life, this was a bad idea and we should just have unions that fight the bosses over pay and conditions and not even really fight them that much. From Europe on the continent, they imported ideas of socialism from the Second International and generally, and also of anarchism. But anarchism and socialism were really small talk shop groups. They met around free speech meetings on Sundays in parks. They placarded, which, okay, when we hold up a poster in a demo, we expect at best it'll get on the news and somebody will laugh at it, whereas holding up a placard in 1880 is a really big social statement. It is the equivalent of television in its day. And none of these meetings, which did Sunday schools or small failing pamphlet endeavours, moved throughout the working class movement generally. They didn't result in candidates to Parliament, and the working men who were elected at this time were elected on liberal positions as Lib Lab candidates, they called them, and they weren't bound to do anything in particular. 1890 brings the first major depression to Australia. There had previously been recessions, but you could shift industry and get by more or less, whereas from 1890 there's 20 years of depression for working class people. The depression for the bosses cures by 1894. Now what does that sound like, people? capital tried to sweat it out of labour's back, the loss of profitability. And this involved breaking union contracts in wool and the ports. In 1890s, the employers refused to recognise the Master Mariners Union, so the people who control the ships had unionised, claiming that their affiliation to Trades Hall in Melbourne was unacceptable. So the dock strike kicks off with a professional white-collar union. And who comes out to back them? The seamen and the dock workers. And they fight and they lose, and it's 30% pay cuts all round. And the recession deepens, and with mass unemployment, they decide to attack the Shearers Union. Now, the Shearers Union, which is today called the AWU, Australian Workers' Union, and has long been called that, worked on a new basis. They sent out paid organisers to the region who'd get paid on the basis of the number of men they unionised. And they did pretty well, because this is a geographically dispersed mass union that they're unionising, unlike, say, stonecutters in Melbourne. I'm going to have to beg another 5 minutes, I'm sorry. So when the shearers went out because the bosses picked the fight, the dock workers went out in solidarity, refusing to touch scab wool. The employers brought in scabs. The shearers moved into camps outside of their shearing stations. And then bosses burnt workers' camps, and workers burnt shearing sheds and equipment, and the troops were called in. And the workers lost. But it wasn't really the physical repression that caused them to lose. They ran out of food. They weren't prepared for a long strike to win. And wage cuts all round like normal when we lose in this kind of situation. But it was a mass strike of a mass union of new, ununionised, unskilled workers. It wasn't just the gun shearers who shore 100 a day. This is every worker pretty much in the sector. And then there was a follow-on strike in 1894, which was also lost. The strikers had varied ideas, like the cooperative Commonwealth that I was talking about. And this is where we come to the birth of the Labor Party. In the colonies, a fragment of the labour movement, a leadership steeped in bargaining with the bosses over pay, predominantly in skilled unions, and selling out union rate at a higher rate to the bosses, saw the results of these strikes and saw that direct action would not get the goods. Now, I think that they were wrong. And they turned to Parliament because they saw that the support for the employers had come from Parliament. They also turned to Parliament because the platform of things which they wanted was stuff like compulsory arbitration, as if the bosses would ever agree to give us what we want through their own courts. They wanted the stopping of labour migration from overseas, but they were happy to settle on British migration only. So they were happy to be racists. They wanted a new national democracy, so they were happy to buy into the narrative of federation on the bosses' basis. They also wanted the sale of Crown land to be stopped. Now, they might have said that nationalisation was the long-term goal, but their immediate goals, also other than stopping the squattocracy owning all of Australia, is some idea of land ownership and a respectable, skilled, male, small fragment working class controlling the rest of the labour movement. They founded Labor parties in the different states, and the Labor parties more or less did fairly well. I rarely quote Lenin, but Lenin typified the Australian Labor Party as liberal bourgeois, doing the role that a liberal party would do in Europe, because the rest of the parties in Australia were so conservative that they wouldn't develop capitalism. The Labor Party borrowed directly from the Shearers organisation and used paid organisers, and they went out and they got membership dues, and they got the small businessmen and the church leaders and the teetotaler Methodists in, and the small dairy farmers in on side. And so from the very beginning, the Labor Party was a party for the Australian working class, and perhaps involving a lot of the Australian working class, but not of it. There was always a debate within it about developing capitalism better for these small capitalists and petite bourgeois and anti-alcohol Methodist preachers. And this meant that the Labor Party became less and less socialist over time. And this led the socialist parties and organisations to become more Labourite. Now, admittedly, with the variety of ideas going on in these socialist parties, you can't really blame them, because Labourism was also a revolutionary tradition, even within the Labor Party to a very small and lessening extent. And many of the members of these socialist organisations were simultaneously Labor Party members. The most important one which Thomas Mann was involved in organising, was the reorganised Victorian Socialist Party in 1905, which I think had 1,500 members peak, and most of whom were also in the ALP. And it had there's this American guy called Daniel De Leon, who kind of was an American Lenin up until 1917. De Leon died long before Lenin, but he had similar ideas that parties should be bound by what they've agreed to put forward as a platform, and parties should be seriously organised, not sloppy talk shops, that people should be united in a party together. And the VSP had a lot of that sentiment, but they were still pluralistic. They still had Bellamy's utopian socialist ideas going on. The anarchist response and organised anarchism dissipated into communities, into unions and into the Labor Party. A story coming out of Turner is in 1887 the Australian Socialist League was founded. It was half anarchist, 50% of whom were moral force anarchists. We can win people over by ideas. 50% of whom were physical force anarchists, that we should do it by ourselves. But Turner says by 1890 the anarchists had left. So anarchism, unlike the socialists, unlike the labourites, unlike the reformist streak in Australian Marxism imported from the Second International, were far less organised. They had a book club in Melbourne for about 6 years, but still, this is the talking shop of the labour community in general. And people are going to anti-alcohol and pro-alcohol meetings and all kinds of meetings, and anarchism just stands as one of those small strands at the time. Labor came to power. It came to power at first as the party occupying the balance of power in the middle. And it kind of fractured the early New South Wales Labor Party. About 16 of their members went with the platform and being bound by caucus and conference and what they'd agreed to vote for in Parliament, and about 10 of them ratted. And at the next election, most of the rats lost their seats, whereas most of the platform Labor Party members kept their seats. And the rats who got their seats back moved into the bourgeois parties very rapidly. And so the Labor Party learnt something about executive control that has lasted to today. Now, this does mean that for a certain long period of time, bits of what they got elected to do, they try to do, but at the same time, it cemented this control, not in the branch rank and file of the Labor Party, but in the parliamentary caucus and in the executive and in the conference of the Labor Party, separated from the working class, which leaves them learning at a distance, at best, from the workers who they claim to represent, while always the Methodist preacher bangs on about a 5 o'clock swill. And who do they listen to? They've got 2 ears and 2 voices, and they listen pretty much half and half. But Labor also came to power in its own right. And it embarked on a program of compulsory arbitration, which we'll deal with next week more in depth, but covering just a little bit of this. Compulsory arbitration meant those unorganised unions where women and young men were too difficult to control were now possible, because you could just go to the courts and say, we've got